The short Stirling was the first four-engine heavy bomber to be introduced into service with the Royal Air Force during World War II. Derived from the S-25 Sunderland flying boat, 2,371 units were built, entering squadron service in early 1941. But constrained by forced design decisions, the Stirling was quickly superseded, and just 2 years later, in March of 1943, Stirlings were already being phased out of bomber duty, seeing more use for dropping mines outside German ports, towing gliders, and dropping spies deep behind enemy lines at night. The RAF's decision to invest in a large four-engined heavy bomber was quite a surprise in early 1936. The demands on engine production and maintenance were increasingly stretching production capacity, especially with the introduction of so many new types into service. So it's not so surprising that the Royal Air Force was interested primarily in twin-engine bombers. And as such, they invested heavily in development of huge engines in the 2,000 horsepower class in order to improve performance per engine. However, the US and USSR were already developing bombers with four smaller engines instead, which proved to have excellent range and fair lifting capacity. So in mid-1936, the RAF decided to hedge their bets and develop a four-engine bomber as well. The British Air Ministry's Specification B-1236 called for a 8,000-pound bomb load carried to a range of 3,000 miles. Incidentally, this range included Berlin, or a 14,000-pound bomb load to closer targets. As well, the aircraft should also be able to be used as a troop transport for soldiers, with an idea that it would fly troops close to a front line and then support them with bombing. To help with this task, as well as ease production, it was required to be able to be broken down into parts for transport by train. Envisioned to be operating from limited airfields, which included most RAF bases in Britain at the time, requirements specified the aircraft needed to lift off from a 500-foot runway and able to clear 50-foot high trees at the end, a significant task. So the ministry added the remarkable requirement that the aircraft could be capable of being catapult-launched. Also, the aircraft would be able to carry torpedoes. Thankfully, the fact that RAF Coastal Command thought such a big aircraft would be prohibitively expensive to buy and operate had this requirement dropped early. Lastly, reportedly, so it would fit into existing hangars, the wingspan should not exceed 100 feet. But this last requirement was particularly odd, as the most common Type C hangar opened to over 125 feet. So, it was more likely the RAF, that had already had bad experiences with some types with large wingspans, mainly with taxing accidents, sought a limit to the wingspan. It is indeed safe to say the wingspan and catapult requirements were due to the limited size and lack of paving on RAF bases prior to 1938, when land requisition and concerted effort saw RAF bases significantly expanded and upgraded. The initial bid was offered to just about every operating British aircraft company, though only two would be selected for prototype production in 1937, Shorts with their S-29 and Supermarines Type 317, and it was the Type 317 that was the preferred aircraft. Unfortunately, fate intervened for Supermarine, the death of lead designer R.J. Mitchell in June 1937, and Supermarine's almost complete commitment to building his Spitfire meant that the company gradually slipped behind on development. Later, a German bombing raid in 1940 destroyed the only existing Type 317 prototypes. The short Stirling was the only option remaining. Short's success was due to adopting one of its existing designs to the new specifications. Its S-29 design was basically a S-25 Sunderland with its lower deck and boat hull removed. The S-29 was largely identical otherwise. The wings and controls were the same and construction was identical. Shorts also managed to persuade the RAF to dismiss most of its unrealistic design goals once they saw that the S-29 would be an excellent bomber. But on one point the RAF stood firm. The S-29 used the Sunderland's 114-foot wing, and they demanded it be reduced to less than 100 feet. Thus, in order to get the needed lift, the resulting redesigned S-29 wing was thickened and reshaped. Its superstructure was built of aluminium alloys, and to reduce drag, the metal skin was carefully flush riveted. To further reduce drag, both the forward and rear undercarriages were retractable, a feature that was rare on high-performance fighters of the day, let alone on a huge bomber. The first few S-29s sported the Hercules II engine, but the majority received the 1,500 horsepower Hercules 11, now designated the Stirling in accordance with British policy of naming their bombers after towns and cities. An initial 200 aircraft were ordered off the drawing board in early 1938. But following the Sudeten crisis and the subsequent Munich Agreement in September 1938, the British increased its order to 1,500 aircraft, making the Shorts-built bomber the principal intended heavy bomber of the RAF Bomber Command. The first production, Stirling conducted its first flight on the 7th of May 1940, but due to a combination of the need to focus production on fighter capacity before and after the Battle of Britain and the impact of the ongoing bombing campaign of the Luftwaffe, which hit both Shorts factories in Rochester, south of England, and Belfast in Northern Ireland, production was significantly hampered. Hampering further was the difficulties with training new crews in the use of the huge four-engine aircraft and the general lack of the expert fitters required for the sudden surge of demand. The staff who would basically build the aircraft by hand were difficult to find and train. Thus, it wasn't until February 1941 that the type flew their first bombing missions. The short Stirling Mk I was 87 feet 3 inches long, stood 22 feet 9 inches tall, had a wingspan of 99 feet 1 inch, and a wing area of 1,460 square feet. Powered by 4 Bristol Hercules 11 14-cylinder air-cooled sleeve valve radial piston engines, providing 1,500 horsepower each, giving it a maximum speed of 282 miles per hour at 12,500 feet, and a cruise speed of 200 miles per hour. It had a range of 2,330 miles. Due to its constrained wingspan and an increased weight, its service ceiling was limited to just 1,500 feet, making it highly susceptible to the formidable German flak batteries. It had a rate of climb of 800 feet per minute. For armament, it sported 8 303 Browning machine guns, 2 in a powered nose turret, 4 in its tail turret, and 2 in a dorsal turret. It also started service with a single retractable ventral dustbin turret located just behind the bomb bay. This proved almost useless due to cramped conditions, with the added problem that the turret tended to drop and hit the ground when taxiing over bumps. Thus, this retractable turret was removed almost from the start. It could carry up to 14,000 pounds of bombs, but with such a load, its range was significantly reduced to just 590 miles. On typical missions, deep into Germany or Italy, a smaller 3,500-pound payload was carried, consisting of 7 500-pound bombs. It also had a large strengthening beam, partitioning the middle of the bomb bay, limiting its use for bombs up to 2,000 pounds. Thus, as 4,000-pound cookies and even larger specials were developed, the Stirling became even more redundant. Its crew consisted of a pair of pilots who were supported by a navigator, who doubled as the bomb aimer, a front gunner, who doubled as the wireless operator, 2 further gunners, and a flight engineer. There was intended to be a Mark II, built in Canada using 1,600 horsepower Wright R2600 twin cyclone engines, but the demand for other aircraft in 1941 saw the contract cancelled with no Mark IIs built. The Mark III, introduced in 1943, was similar with the exception of a new dorsal turret and the inclusion of 1,635 horsepower Hercules, 16 engines, which improved maximum speed to 270 miles per hour. They were also kitted with the latest electronic countermeasures, H2S radars, ventral antennas for the mandrel jamming system, a ventral chaff chute to jam Freya and Würzburg radars, as well as ventral antenna for the blind approach beacon system, and a Monica rear warning radar in the tail turret. The Mark IV series was built without the nose and dorsal turrets for towing gliders and dropping paratroops, and built for the same purpose, the Mark V removed the tail turret as well. The huge size of the Stirling, being 18 feet longer than the Lancaster, belied its maneuverability. Its shorter and thicker wing delighted its pilots as they discovered that it could outturn the Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters they faced. But its relatively low operational ceiling of around 17,000 feet made it much more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters compared to other heavy bombers. And in a chilling reminder of its vulnerability, within 5 months of being introduced, 67 out of 84 aircraft had been lost to enemy action or written off after crashes. Due to the many delays in design and production, it wasn't until February 1941 its first operational combat mission was performed, flown by just 3 Stirlings against fuel storage tanks at Vlaardingen near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. By all reports, they acquitted themselves well. But just a month later, another new 4-engine heavy, the Halifax, performed its own maiden mission, followed soon after by the Avro Lancaster. The Stirling was becoming redundant at a rate of knots. Still, with the Stirling now in full-scale production, including at 2 new shadow factories, by the end of 1941, 3 RAF squadrons had been equipped. Stirlings flew on day and night bombing operations and had been found to be most capable of standing up to enemy interceptor aircraft by using a sweeping combination of fighters and bombers, a tactic which became known as the Circus Offensive. From late 1941, the Stirling also played a pioneering role in the formation of the RAF's Pathfinder Squadrons, specialist navigation and target-finding squadrons, to assist main force squadrons. By February 1942, the British recognized that their targeted bombing efforts was causing unsustainable losses without the effect desired. Thus was implemented the Area Bombing Directive, where the RAF switched to much larger and more indiscriminate bombing operations, seeking to destroy Germany's ability to fight through sheer attrition, flattening their key industrial cities and transportation nodes. Naturally, this saw the Stirling heavily employed, and Stirlings took part in the first of the 1,000 bomber raids when the city of Cologne was attacked at the end of May 1942. From the spring of 1942, the number of Stirlings in service began to increase, peaking at 20 squadrons in 1944. From May 1943, raids on Germany were often conducted using over 100 Stirling bombers at a time. Remarkably, Stirlings flew a total of 14,500 sorties, during which 27,000 tons of bombs were dropped, but at a horrible cost, despite being a tough design where it was far from unusual for them to stagger back in a condition that few other aircraft would have been able to survive, with one Stirling that suffered a head-on collision with a German fighter over the city of Hamburg still managed to return to base. 582 Stirling aircraft were lost in action, while a further 119 were written off. These high losses and low ordnance delivery capability saw the Stirling gradually replaced in the bomber role by the Avro Lancaster and Halifax, which could carry larger bomb loads over greater distances and at higher altitudes. By December 1943, Stirlings were withdrawn from frontline service as bombers. Despite this, the Stirling found a new lease of life in different roles. It was used extensively as a glider tug, particularly during the D-Day landings and Operation Market Garden. It also served as a transport aircraft for paratroopers and supplies, electronic countermeasures, and for dropping sea mines around German ports, a process termed gardening. By the end of the war, the short Stirling had proved to be a valuable and versatile, albeit somewhat limited, asset to the RAF. It had played a significant role in the early stages of the strategic bombing campaign and continued to be an essential aircraft for transport and glider towing operations. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share with your friends, and leave a comment below. If you want to see more like this, please subscribe to the channel.